April 22, 1951, Yeoncheon, Korea. 8 o'clock in the evening. Artillery shells rained down on the Turkish brigade. The Chinese spring offensive had begun. 40,000 soldiers of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army were moving through the night, 4 full divisions, the biggest offensive of the entire Korean War. The Turkish brigade received orders to withdraw. The Puerto Rican 65th Infantry Regiment fell back to regroup. The U.S. 3rd Infantry Division began its retreat. 900 Filipino soldiers of the 10th Battalion Combat Team were left holding the line, alone, surrounded, cut off from headquarters, outnumbered 44-1. And what happened in the next 14 hours would inspire General Douglas MacArthur to say the most famous words he ever spoke about any fighting force in the world. "Give me 10,000 Filipinos, and I will conquer the world." This is the Battle of Yultong, the greatest untold military achievement in Filipino history, and the story of why 900 men changed the outcome of the Korean War. In September 1950, 7,400 Filipino volunteers sailed to Korea. They answered the United Nations call to defend South Korea against communist invasion. The first to arrive was the 10th Battalion Combat Team, 1,367 officers and men, volunteers, every single one of them. Nobody was drafted. They chose this. Korea in 1950 was nothing like the Philippines, frozen mountains, temperatures far below zero, a completely alien environment. But the Filipinos adapted immediately. They learned to fight in the cold. They learned to move across frozen ground. They became one of the most effective units in the entire United Nations force. Before Yultong, the 10th BCT had already made history. At the Battle of Mudong, they won the first battle ever fought by Filipino soldiers on foreign soil. 50 North Korean soldiers killed, 1 Filipino lost. The Americans noticed. From March to April 1951, the 10th BCT moved so fast across Korea that UN Command had to radio them to slow down. They were consistently ahead of every other unit on the line, aggressive, fearless, effective. But 6 months of combat and the brutal Korean winter had taken a toll, from 1,367 men down to 900. Every survivor was a hardened veteran. Every man still standing had already proven himself in real battle. They had seen combat. They had seen death. They knew what war was. On April 22nd, the 10th BCT was positioned at the center of the United Nations line. Turkish Brigade on their right, Puerto Rican 65th on their left, the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division behind them, a defensive line stretching across the Imjin River Valley near Yeoncheon. The Filipinos held the center, the most critical position on the entire front. What they didn't know was what was coming for them. Chinese commander Peng Dehuai had assigned 40,000 soldiers specifically to break through this point, 4 full divisions. His target was the 10th BCT. His objective was to punch through the center, surround the entire 3rd Infantry Division, and destroy it completely. 40,000 versus 900. The odds weren't a tactical challenge. They were supposed to be a massacre. April 22nd, 8 o'clock in the evening, the barrage began. Artillery hit the Turkish positions first, then crept toward the Filipino line. Shells walking up the hillsides one explosion at a time. The 900 Filipino soldiers of the 10th BCT pressed into their foxholes. They had been under fire before, but nothing like this. This wasn't a probe or a skirmish. This was the full weight of 4 Chinese divisions preparing to roll over them. Shortly after midnight, word came. The Turkish brigade was withdrawing, ordered to fall back to Line, Kansas, south of the Hantan River. Their departure tore open the right flank of the Filipino position. Chinese forces immediately poured through the gap, attacking the exposed right side. At the same time, the Puerto Rican regiment on the left was pushed back several hundred yards. Both flanks were now open. 900 Filipinos were now surrounded on 3 sides. The Chinese were pressing in from every direction. There was no support coming, no communication with headquarters, no reinforcements. The only direction they could retreat was south, and even that was filling with enemy soldiers. They were alone. Baker Company, commanded by Lieutenant Jose Arteaga Jr., was defending Yultong Hill, the most strategic point on the entire Filipino line. Whoever controlled that hill controlled the battlefield. The Chinese knew this. They attacked in waves, thousands at a time, human wave tactics, bodies replacing bodies. The weight of 40,000 throwing itself against 900 men who refused to move. Baker Company fought them back, then fought them back again and again. For 4 hours, Lieutenant Arteaga's men held that hill against forces 10 times their strength. Every man firing until his barrel was too hot to touch, then changing barrels, then firing again. The Chinese kept coming, wave after wave, climbing over their own dead, convinced that numbers alone would break the Filipino line. At 3 in the morning, the position was finally breached. The Chinese were through. They infiltrated so deeply they reached Charlie Company in the reserve area, the second line of defense. Lieutenant Arteaga was killed fighting to slow them down, 26 years old. He died on that hill so his men could pull back. He was posthumously awarded the Philippine Distinguished Conduct Star. Communications were cut. The 10th BCT was blind. No information from headquarters, no orders coming, no idea what was happening anywhere else on the line. They were fighting completely alone in the dark. Battalion Commander Lieutenant Colonel Dionisio Ojeda received the only order that made sense given the situation: withdraw. Pull back to Line, Kansas. The position was unsustainable. Every company in the 10th BCT received the order. Every company began preparing to comply. Every company except one. Because first, something extraordinary was happening inside the Filipino perimeter. The Chinese assault had penetrated so deeply that support personnel were face-to-face with enemy soldiers. The battalion cook was in the kitchen area when Chinese troops came through. He looked around, put down what he was doing, picked up a weapon, and fought. The medics were treating wounded when the enemy reached them. They put down their medical kits, picked up rifles, and fought. The typists and clerks heard the shooting getting closer. They left their desks, armed themselves, and fought. The drivers, the radio operators, the supply sergeants, every man who could hold a weapon was now in the battle. This was no longer a military unit with defined roles and support staff. This was 900 Filipino men who had made a collective decision. Nobody sits this out. Everybody fights. And then the battalion chaplain set down his Bible, looked at the chaos around him, and picked up a rifle and fought. Think about what that means. The man of God, the man whose entire purpose was to pray for the living and comfort the dying, the man who had taken vows of peace and mercy. He looked at the situation and decided that prayer alone was not enough for this moment, that his men needed every hand available, that sometimes faith means standing with your brothers even when it means picking up a weapon. The chaplain fought, not because he wanted to, because he had to, because that's what this moment required. 900 soldiers, not one bystander, not one man hiding in a bunker waiting for it to be over. Every Filipino in that perimeter made the same choice: to fight, to hold, to not leave a single man behind. The cooks fought, the chaplain fought, especially the chaplain. Captain Conrado Dumlao Yap, commander of Heavy Weapons Company, born January 22, 1921 in Candelaria, Zambales. Philippine Military Academy graduate class of 1943. Trained at the United States Army Armor School at Fort Knox. And in the early morning of April 23, 1951, the man who would become the most decorated Filipino of the entire Korean War. Yap received word that a platoon from Baker Company was still on Yultong Hill, trapped, surrounded, unable to withdraw. Lieutenant Arteaga was dead, and those men were going to be killed or captured if nobody came for them. The hill was behind Chinese lines now. Getting to them meant going through thousands of enemy soldiers. It was a suicide mission. Yap had been given the authority to withdraw. The retreat order was legal. It was reasonable. With 40,000 Chinese soldiers between him and that hill, nobody would have blamed him for following the order. Nobody would have questioned his courage. He had already proven himself in combat. He had earned the right to save himself and his company. The order was clear. Pull back to Line, Kansas. Leave the hill. There was nothing more that could be done. Captain Conrado Yap refused to leave his men behind. He rallied his heavy weapons company, the only Filipino unit with tanks, M24 Chaffee light tanks, not the M4 Sherman medium tanks they were supposed to have. Those had been destroyed when North Korea pushed south early in the war. The Chafees were smaller, lighter armor, weaker guns, but they had treads, they had steel, they had main guns that could fire, and they had Conrado Yap. The counterattack began, moving forward, advancing into the Chinese lines, against 40,000 enemy soldiers, going in the exact opposite direction of every other United Nations unit on the entire battlefield. It was insane. It violated every principle of military tactics. You don't counterattack into a force 44 times your size. You don't advance when you're surrounded. You don't go back for a handful of men when thousands are trying to kill you. Unless you're Captain Conrado Yap, and those men on the hill are yours, and leaving them is something you cannot do. Yap himself stood in the commander's hatch of his tank, fully exposed to enemy fire. No armor protecting him from the waist up, machine gun in his hands, firing at Chinese soldiers who were everywhere, bullets snapping past his head, explosions all around. His tank crew below firing the main gun as fast as they could reload. The Chaffee lurching forward through the dark, blazing a trail of fire toward Yultong Hill. This was not the action of a commander directing from the rear. This was Conrado Yap personally fighting his way through 40,000 Chinese soldiers to rescue a handful of trapped Filipinos. Standing exposed in a tank hatch, making himself a target because speed mattered more than safety. Because his men on that hill needed to see him coming. Because sometimes leadership means being the first one into the fire. The counterattack caught the Chinese completely off guard. Nobody counterattacks into an assault this size. Nobody moves forward when surrounded. The sheer audacity of it created confusion. Chinese units trying to figure out what was happening, how many Filipinos were counterattacking, whether this was a battalion or a division. In the chaos and darkness, Yap's company looked bigger than it was, and the confusion bought time. They reached Yultong Hill, found the survivors of Baker Company, wounded, exhausted, out of ammunition, but alive. Men who would have died on that hill or spent the rest of the war in a Chinese prison camp without Conrado Yap's decision to disobey the withdrawal order. He had gone back for them, against impossible odds, because they were his men, and he did not leave his men. Yap directed the rescue. Get the wounded out first, count every soldier, make sure nobody is left behind. His company provided covering fire while the trapped platoon withdrew. Bullets everywhere, artillery landing around them, the Chinese trying to cut off the rescue. But the Filipinos held, extracted every survivor, recovered the bodies of the fallen, accounted for every man. Then machine gun fire struck Captain Conrado Yap. He was directing the final withdrawal, making sure the last men were clear, counting soldiers as they passed his position. The bullets hit while he was still exposed in the tank hatch, still directing, still leading. He fell, mortally wounded, and he died on Yultong Hill on April 23, 1951. He was 30 years old. His final act was covering the withdrawal of his men. Every soldier who had been trapped on that hill was extracted. Nobody was left behind. Captain Yap made sure of that before he died. His last moments were spent getting his men to safety. That was who Conrado Yap was. That was what mattered to him more than his own life. But Yap's counterattack had done something beyond rescuing one platoon. It had disrupted the entire Chinese advance, had thrown their timing off, had created chaos in their ranks. It had bought precious time for the rest of the 10th BCT to reorganize. The battalion established a new defensive line, stronger positions, better fields of fire. And they held it until dawn. While the 900 Filipinos held, the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division completed its withdrawal to line Kansas safely. 15,000 American soldiers pulled back without being encircled or destroyed. Without the 10th BCT's stand, that division faced potential annihilation. The Chinese plan had been to break through the center, surround the Americans, and destroy them. 900 Filipino soldiers stopped 40,000 Chinese and saved an entire American division, not because they were superhuman, because they refused to break. At first light on April 23rd, the Chinese spring offensive began to lose its momentum. The pressure that had seemed unstoppable all night finally began to ease. Chinese casualties had been catastrophic. They had thrown thousands of men against 900 Filipinos and been unable to break through. The cost was too high. The offensive stalled. With Allied units safe, the 10th BCT launched a full battalion counterattack at dawn. 900 Filipino soldiers who had held defensive positions all night now went on the offensive. They retook Yultong Hill, the strategic position that Baker Company had defended with their lives. The hill where Lieutenant Artiana had died. The hill where Captain Yap had died rescuing his men. It was back in Filipino hands. When they counted the cost, the numbers were almost impossible to believe. Chinese soldiers killed, over 500. Filipino soldiers killed, 12. Missing, 6. Wounded, 38. For every Filipino who died, 17 Chinese soldiers were dead. 17 to 1. Not in a movie, not in a legend, on a real hill in Korea on April 23, 1951. American, Turkish, and Puerto Rican soldiers witnessed it. They saw 900 Filipinos hold against 40,000. They counted the bodies. They knew what had happened, and they could not believe what they had seen. 900 soldiers surrounded by 40,000 had not broken, had not surrendered, had not failed. They had held their line. They had rescued their trapped men. They had saved their allies, and they had won. Captain Conrado Yap was posthumously awarded the Philippine Medal of Valor, the equivalent of the American Medal of Honor, the highest decoration the Republic of the Philippines can bestow on any soldier. Given for acts of conspicuous courage and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. Yap's action on Yultong Hill met every criterion. He had disobeyed a legal order because obeying it meant leaving his men to die. He had led a counterattack into impossible odds. He had exposed himself to enemy fire to direct the rescue. And he had died making sure every one of his men got off that hill alive. The United States awarded Captain Yap the Distinguished Service Cross, America's second highest military decoration for valor in combat. The citation reads, "For extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy while serving with the 10th Battalion Combat Team, Philippine Expeditionary Forces to Korea." The award recognized that an Allied soldier had displayed the kind of courage that transcends nationality, that heroism at this level demands recognition regardless of what flag you serve under. In 2018, on the 65th anniversary of the Korean War Armistice, South Korea awarded Captain Conrado Yap the first Taeguk Cordon of the Order of Military Merit, the highest military honor the Republic of Korea can give. Awarded 67 years after the battle, because South Korea had not forgotten, because the Korean people understood that 12 Filipino soldiers had died on Korean soil defending Korean freedom, because some debts can never be repaid, but they must always be acknowledged. Philippines, United States, South Korea, 3 nations, 3 highest honors. Captain Conrado Yap is the only Filipino soldier in Korean War history to be decorated by 3 separate countries with their most prestigious awards simultaneously. The only one. His chest carried the evidence of extraordinary heroism recognized by 3 different nations who all witnessed the same impossible courage. General Douglas MacArthur had commanded the largest armies in Pacific theater history. He had seen what Filipino warriors were capable of during World War II. He had watched the Filipino resistance against Japan. He had seen Filipino soldiers fight in conditions that would break other men. But the Battle of Yultong confirmed something MacArthur had always believed about Filipino warriors, something that 900 men proved on a hill in Korea against 40,000 Chinese soldiers. Give me 10,000 Filipinos, and I will conquer the world. These were not empty words, not flattery, not propaganda. MacArthur had commanded millions of soldiers. He had seen the greatest armies of a generation fight at their absolute best. When he said this about Filipinos, he meant every word, because he had watched 900 of them do what should have been impossible. Hold a line that should have broken, fight odds that should have overwhelmed them, win a battle they should have lost. Among the Philippine Expeditionary Force to Korea was a young lieutenant who would one day become the 12th president of the Philippines, Fidel Ramos. He was there. He served in Korea. He saw what the 10th BCT was capable of, and decades later, as president, he would speak about the Korean War with visible emotion. Because some things you never forget. Some things change you. Ramos had seen Filipino soldiers at their best. He knew what they had done. He carried that knowledge his entire life. In 2019, the Philippine Navy commissioned a warship in Captain Yap's honor, the BRP Conrado Yap, a modern vessel carrying the name of a man who died on a hill in Korea 68 years earlier. Every time that ship sails, it carries the memory of a captain who refused to leave his men behind, who disobeyed orders because obedience meant abandonment, who died making sure every soldier under his command came home. The ship is a reminder. The legacy is permanent. Today, South Korea and the Philippines maintain one of the strongest military alliances in Asia. Korean companies invest billions in the Philippines. Korean tourists fill Filipino beaches. Young Koreans study at Filipino universities. The relationship is deep and genuine, and part of the foundation of that relationship is blood. Filipino blood, shed on Korean soil, at Yultong, at Muldong, across the hills and valleys of a country most Filipinos had never seen before 1950. South Korea remembers. They built a monument. They awarded medals. They made sure the world knew what 900 Filipinos did on April 22nd and 23rd, 1951. There is a monument to the Battle of Yultong, stone and metal, permanent, standing in South Korea, a reminder that 900 men held against 40,000, that a chaplain picked up a rifle, that a captain disobeyed orders to save his men, that cooks and medics and clerks became infantry because the situation demanded it, that Filipinos don't surrender, they don't retreat, they don't leave anyone behind. The monument is there so the world never forgets. Here is the truth that makes Yultong so powerful. These 900 soldiers were not elite special forces. They were not career military professionals with decades of experience. They were not genetically engineered warriors. They were ordinary Filipino men, farmers' sons, teachers' sons, working-class Filipinos from ordinary places, volunteers who had never seen Korea before September 1950, men who could have stayed home, who chose to go, who chose to fight, who chose to hold when everyone else retreated. The cook who picked up a rifle had probably never expected to be in direct combat. He was someone's husband, someone's father. He had a job that was supposed to keep him away from the front line, but when the Chinese broke through, he didn't hide. He didn't wait for someone else to handle it. He picked up a weapon and fought. Because his brothers needed him. Because 900 men surrounded by 40,000 don't have the luxury of defined roles. Because in that moment, he stopped being a cook and became a warrior. The chaplain had taken vows of peace. His entire life was dedicated to mercy and prayer and spiritual guidance. He was supposed to comfort the dying, not kill the enemy. But he looked at the battle around him and made a decision. Prayer alone was not enough. His men needed every hand that could hold a weapon. So he set down his Bible, picked up a rifle and fought. Not because he wanted to kill, because his brothers needed him. Because some moments require choices that go beyond doctrine. Because being a man of God sometimes means standing with your brothers in the fire. And Captain Conrado Yap had been given legal permission to retreat. Nobody could have blamed him. He had earned the right to save himself. The order was clear and reasonable. 40,000 Chinese soldiers stood between him and the trapped platoon on Yultong Hill. Going back was suicide. But Yap looked at that order and made a different choice. He chose his men over his own safety. He chose leadership over obedience. He chose to die if necessary rather than abandon soldiers who depended on him. That was who Conrado Yap was, a man who believed that leaving people behind was not an option he could ever accept. The 17-to-1 kill ratio did not happen by accident. It was not luck. It was not divine intervention. It was 900 trained Filipino soldiers who refused to accept defeat, who held their positions when overwhelmed, who fought with discipline and courage and the absolute refusal to break. Every man firing until his ammunition ran out, then resupplying, then firing again. Fighting from prepared positions against human wave attacks, making the Chinese pay for every meter of ground. Killing 17 enemy soldiers for every Filipino lost. That ratio is the evidence, the proof, the mathematical reality of what happened when 40,000 Chinese soldiers ran into 900 Filipinos who would not move. Every Allied force on that battlefield had withdrawn. The Turks, the Puerto Ricans, the Americans. 900 Filipinos were left alone. And they held. Not because they didn't understand the odds. They understood perfectly. They were surrounded, cut off, outnumbered 44-to-1. They held anyway, because that's what Filipino soldiers do. They assess the situation, they accept the odds, and they fight anyway. 3 countries put their highest military honor on the chest of one Filipino captain: the Philippines, the United States, South Korea. 3 different nations with 3 different systems of recognition all agreed on the same thing. What Captain Yap did on Yultong Hill was extraordinary. Heroism at a level that transcends borders. Courage that demands recognition regardless of nationality. All 3 countries saw the same thing. All 3 honored it. Because what happened at Yultong was bigger than politics or alliances. It was human courage at its absolute limit. And that deserves to be remembered. Give me 10,000 Filipinos and I will conquer the world. MacArthur didn't have 10,000. He had 900. And they saved his army anyway. They held a line that should have broken. They fought odds that should have destroyed them. They won a battle they should have lost. 900 Filipino soldiers proved that numbers are not the only thing that matters, that courage counts, that discipline matters, that refusing to give up changes outcomes, that sometimes the smaller force wins because they want it more, because they're willing to pay the price, because surrender is not an option they will accept. The Battle of Yultong happened more than 70 years ago. The men who fought it are gone now. Captain Yap is gone. Lieutenant Artiaga is gone. The 12 Filipino soldiers who died on that hill are gone. The chaplain who picked up a rifle is gone. The cook who fought is gone. But the monument stands. The medals exist. The records are clear. The story is documented. 900 Filipinos against 40,000 Chinese. And the Filipinos held. That is who Filipino soldiers are. That is what they do when surrounded and abandoned and outnumbered. They pick up their weapons, all of them. The cooks, the medics, the chaplain, especially the chaplain. And they fight. Not because they don't fear death. They fear it. But they fear failing their brothers more. They fear leading someone behind more. They fear breaking more than they fear dying. Give me 10,000 Filipinos and I will conquer the world. 900 stood, 900 fought, 900 held. And they proved that the number on your side is never the only number that matters. The number that matters is this: Zero. 0 Filipinos retreated when ordered to hold. 0 gave up when surrounded. 0 left their comrades on that hill. 0 surrendered. 0 broke. 0 failed. That is the Battle of Yultong. That is the story the world forgot. That is what 900 Filipino soldiers did on a hill in Korea when 40,000 Chinese soldiers came for them in the night. They held the line. They saved their men. They won the battle, and they changed history. Now you know. Now the world remembers. Now the story lives again.